So we're really glad that you could join us. If you would like, at the bottom, and we'll get a little more into this, we'll do an overview of the Zoom, so anyone who's not familiar will have an opportunity to understand how we're going to use this platform for this webinar. But at the bottom on it's basically the bottom of the screen, over about the 5th button, it says chat. If you want to click on that, you can then type in your name and where you're from. And we just like to see who's here and say hello to you. So, and everyone can see that. So make sure that you push chat and then it should be to everyone. I see Jason. Oh, Oak Ridge, Tennessee. I went to school in Knoxville. Hello, Jason. Great, thank you everyone. It looks like we have a lot of people here from lots of places. Dixon and Rinconada, Vadito, Portland, Santa Fe. Excellent. We are really excited to have you all here. Great. So we're going to go ahead and get started. I'll let Jan-Willem take it from here. And thank you all for coming, and enjoy the webinar.
Hello, everyone. I have a sense actually that not everybody is in yet, because I heard that we might have more than 70 participants. So are we there or no? I see still people coming in. So I think we should maybe wait. And that gives everybody a chance also to sign in the chat box with your name and where you're from. And as I see that basically the numbering of people entering slows down, then I think we can start, because there's still people coming in. So just hold on and keep your system muted so that we can hear each other when it's necessary. Yeah, it's still going. People are coming in. We had thought maybe between 15 and 25 participants, but it's going to be 3-4 times more. And I'm happy, of course, that so many people are interested. Yeah, I think I need to ask all of you to have a little bit of patience and do what you need to do, or get something to drink, or go to the bathroom, because we're not even halfway, but letting people in. I had thought that the doors would be wider, that everybody would come in at the same time, but it is really like almost a physical meeting room where everybody has to go through the door one by one. And it is not as fast as I thought it would be. So Adrian or Leah, can you see how many people are in the waiting room?
Hi, Jan-Willem. There are none right now, and Leah was saying that sometimes folks don't show. In her experience, about half that sign up show, and I can just keep admitting them as we go.
So do you suggest that I get started?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's also what she suggests.
Okay. Then maybe what we should do is then go to the next slide that explains about the Zoom operations. So I'll do that. So Adrian, can you clarify this for people?
Sure. So for those who are Zoom veterans, I hope that you just bear with us for a couple of minutes. And for everyone else that maybe hasn't been on Zoom before, what's going on is that Jan-Willem will present his PowerPoint. He is using his phone, so unfortunately you won't be able to see his face, but with internet access and it just seemed like it was the most efficient and best way to go. But I will keep my face up on the screen. So if you need anything, you'll see me there. You don't have to use your video camera. And if you look at the bottom of your screen, there's a few buttons that I'll go through right now to explain. So the video, the second button to the left says stop video, and you can push that. I'll do mine now. That stops your video and doesn't show your face. So if you feel like you want to eat or get up or do whatever, that's a good way to go, or just not show your face at all. To the left, there's the mute, which is the microphone. I'll mute it now. You couldn't hear me talking. That's the mute. We ask that all participants keep yourselves on mute as we go through the slides. There's also a chat box. That's about the fourth or the fifth to the right. When you click on that chat box, you can see what has been chatting between everyone. And if you look at the bottom, it says to, and there's a button that says everyone in meeting. So keep that on, and when you feel like you have a question, just type in there. Midway through the Zoom meeting, there will be a question and answer session with Jan-Willem where I will be reading out to him those questions rather than you verbalizing things. And then at the end, the last 10 minutes, actually you will be verbalizing your questions, and there'll probably be some typed questions that I'll ask Jan-Willem about. But until then, please keep your mic off like I explained before. Let's see, what else? There is the hand raising option. So when you actually push on I believe your participants button, which may say something else for you. Yes, it says participants. There should be a hand there. So you can push that if you need to ask a question at that last 10 minutes. At the right top corner, there should be a gallery view and also just speaker view. You can toggle between those two to either see everyone that's in the Zoom session or just see Jan-Willem plus his slideshows. Let's see, what else? If you're on the phone right now, please push *6 to mute and unmute yourself and *9 to raise your hand. If you have any technical problems, Leah from the Quivira Coalition, which is one of the partners on this, she is available. The tech support number is at the bottom left-hand side of all the slides. It says tech support 505-393-1355, and she can help you with anything that you need. This will be recorded and publicly distributed. So we will have these videos for you at the end of all the sessions, and we'll tell you how to get them. But just keep in mind that if you don't want your voice heard or your face seen in public, just use the mute and the video instructions that I gave you earlier. And let's see, that's about it. So thank you all and enjoy this fabulous webinar.
Thank you, Adrian. I think that I'm gradually moving forward. I'll leave this up for a couple more seconds, actually, while I introduce myself, so that people who are still coming in, but we're now about 35 or so, can also appreciate reading the Zoom logistics before we move on to the content of the webinar. So my name is Jan-Willem Jansens. I'm the owner of Ecotone Landscape Planning, which is a small business that I operate. It is actually a little bigger than just myself because I subcontract and partner nearly on all my projects. And when the opportunities arise, I will have interns also. I came to this project of soil health presentations as a landscape planner. That's my background by training. And I have developed gradually some expertise in watershed management planning, ecological restoration, and agricultural engineering, which is in fact also my graduate degree, and with a specialization in landscape architecture. So those fields basically are overlapping or integrating knowledge about agriculture, forestry, and water issues and watershed planning. And it is at that intersection that, of course, soil is a very important substance because it, as you will see in the presentation later too, it intersects all those different fields at a very small scale and at a very large scale because pretty much everywhere there is soil. I've been working in the Lower Embudo Valley for about 10 years now. I was invited by both a local acequia association and by the State Environment Department to do a series of projects there that took place in the last several years with some hiatuses in between. These projects generated a watershed plan, several underground restoration projects on erosion control, tree thinning, etc. And it mobilized partners for ongoing work. So in the series of webinars, you will see the experiences I've had in the Embudo Valley for the last 10 years. So soil health has been an interest of mine throughout my work there and actually throughout my career of the last 30 plus years. And as I've been gradually focusing more and more on land health and community well-being, it became very clear that soil health is a very critical component of that. And I was over the moon to hear that a year and a half ago, the state passed the Soil Health Act, and that there were opportunities to start sharing knowledge of soil health with each other and to do pilot projects. And so I took the opportunity of, in that context, developing these webinars. So I'm therefore very excited to share from my insights and experiences with you. And I think at this point, we should move on to the webinar. So the purpose of the webinar is to explore and explain together. And as you can see, there will be 4 webinars. Today, we're focusing on defining and measuring healthy upland soils with a key question as to what is the ecology of the upland ecosystem in the Lower Embudo Watershed and what interactions occur between the surface and soil. There will be following webinars that actually all start at noon, not at 11:30, every 2 weeks following today. And they focus more on restoring soil health in degraded situations and soil health in areas affected by sediment flows as a result of the erosion in degraded uplands, and also soil health maintenance on farms where we don't have that much sediment and where we deal with native soil. All the webinars also address the indicators of land and soil health below and above ground and how they are connected with each other and what the role is of fungal networks and the soil microbiome in, for instance, accumulating carbon and storing water. We're also looking at the impacts of erosion and sedimentation increasingly throughout the series and what common soil health problems we might encounter and what we can do about them. And overarching and throughout everything is the concept of the 5 soil health principles that I will introduce in this webinar today and explain further in all the following webinars. So today, we're looking at the focus area of the Lower Embudo Valley with a study area around the Arroyo de los Arianos, which is very interesting, and you'll see why. And then the basics of soil health monitoring, in which I explain what soil really is and an entire suite of related questions. And about halfway, we will then have a brief Q&A for about 5 minutes, in which you can submit questions through the chat box, and that then will be moderated by Adrian so that I can address some of the questions. Maybe the questions can be combined or so, so that we can address them within about 5 minutes. If your question is not addressed, hold it. Maybe it becomes clear throughout the presentation, or if the question remains, you can address it again, or we can address it again at the end during a Q&A. We're going to then look, after the little break, what soil health is and how soil health can degrade. And then, of course, knowing or understanding how soil health degrades, what can we do to keep soil healthy or restore it? And that is tightly linked to the 5 soil health principles. And then we're going to talk about how to use those principles in monitoring or testing or assessment methods and in restoration methods. And most of these restoration methods will be shown in the other webinars, not so much today. And that leads us then to a Q&A and discussion. And after that, a very brief sneak peek forward to the other webinars and some closing information, and a call to you to fill out an evaluation survey in the form of we will be sending you an email with the information and a link to the PowerPoint and some other information, so that with that, we hope to get your survey information back, because that helps us understand whether it's been effective for you to follow this webinar. Okay. Our focus area, the Lower Embudo Watershed. So the Lower Embudo Watershed is pretty much this area here that you can see on the map. And for those on the phone, I will explain what you can see. It is the area just upstream from the Rio Grande, where the Rio Embudo merges with the Rio Grande. And it is the hillsides bounded by the mesas on the north and the south, and the box canyon of Cañoncito just below Pico Ruiz Pueblo on the east side. And this area, which is about 20,000 acres, is mostly owned by BLM and the State Land Office, and maybe a little bit the U.S. Forest Service. And only the area along the river is privately owned, as you can see, the bluely hatched area along the river. The area's geology is really old. It consists of rocks formed by volcanoes and sediments. And the core of it dates back nearly 2 billion years. And the sediments that are eroding right now are up to 3 million years old. So over time, as a result of all that erosion, as a result of streams that used to flow there even millions of years ago, a lot of dirt has moved down and fills basically the Rio Embudo Valley bottom, and has left sandstone valleys on either side of this bottomland valley around Dixon. There is very little vegetation, actually, because the terrain is so rocky and still very erosive. And as a result of that high level of erosion, it's often called a badlands landscape, which is a technical term for highly eroded land. Interesting also is that the river meanders through several narrows, which I will show a little later, which are called the embudos. And embudo is a narrow or funnel in Spanish. And as a result of that, the river was called Rio Embudo. So the area is a semi-desert mountain climate landscape with variable rainfall and snowfall, but around 12 inches per year. We wish it would be 20. So in the higher elevations, there is more of a snow input, kind of to the east of this map, you could say, to the right. But in the study area here, we are dealing mostly with very heavy rainstorms. And as I said, they lead to a lot of erosion, and that erosion can be as much as 1,000 tons per year. In some bad years, 10,000 tons of sediment flow into the river. And in 2014, when we did measurements, we found that 14,000 tons or 1,410 10-ton dump trucks of sediment were flowing into the river. And if you're not familiar with the area, I will have pictures to show you how serious that erosion really is. The surprising thing is that the soil of the lower Embudo is actually mildly erodible, but it's a result of so much land use and degradation over time that at this point it is very erodible when it is hit by energies that bring that soil down. So here we're looking at the Embudos, the narrows. To the bottom left is the Box Canyon that flows down from the plateau around Peñasco, past Picoris, and to the village of Cañoncito, a couple of miles east of Dixon. Then the picture bottom on our top right is the Embudo, the narrows or the funnel just west of Dixon. And then the bottom right picture is the one along Highway 68, just near the confluence of where the Rio Embudo merges with the Rio Grande. It is important to understand the different landscape types, and that will come back in a lot of the presentations. And therefore, I have this slide that shows basically the landscape from the highlands of the mesas and the mountains all the way down to the river. And while I'm talking, you can actually maybe read part of it. The interesting part is today we're going to talk mostly about the Sierra area, the forest, the montes, the woodlands and rangelands, and the secano, which is the dry farming or grazing areas. And in many cases, it is not even used very actively. Just above the acequias and where the village is right now. The other landscape types are the irrigated areas just below the first acequia. They're sometimes called the acequia alta and altitos. Then you have the fertile, high-quality irrigated lands, La Jolla, and then sometimes the second acequia, which could be the acequia baja, and La Vega, which is the grasslands, the pastures, the orchards. And this is, of course, a schematic. Where you live, if you live in the valley, you may not recognize this perfectly, but this is a schematic of how many villages in northern New Mexico are structured. And this structure was imposed by Phillips II in the 1500s, very well described in several publications by Juan Esteban Arellano, who studied the history of settlement areas of Hispano villages in northern New Mexico. And then eventually you get the La Cienega and Bosque and the river at the bottom end. As I mentioned before, the uplands that we're talking about above the irrigated areas are mostly owned by the BLM and State Trust Land, the State Land Office. So let's move on. So here are some images of those different landscape types that we're going to look at today. So the Sierra is the highest areas above the valley, the mesa tops of the Cejita Mesa, and the mountain ridges extending from Copper Hill just west of Picoris. Although all these pictures are on the south side of the river, looking north, and the picture to the right is the top of the mesa. Then a little lower are these badly eroded sandstone rock areas, very steep, poorly vegetated, called the montes. And then the focus area of the Secano, which is even lower, that runs pretty much to the state road or the county road that is at the bottom, along which the villages are developed. You see again scattered vegetation of pinon and juniper, and quite a few erosive slopes with a lot of sediment that is either pulled there by gravity or by water and wind. And those areas are also remarkably cut through, you could say, by arroyos, and some of the arroyos are very narrow, maybe just 3, 4, 5 feet, and very sandy, like in the top left corner, you can see that. Some of them have even springs and wetlands, like the one at the bottom left, and some are broad, sandy, gravelly arroyos, like the major arroyos that many people know there, and they can be 20, 30, 40 feet wide. They all form conveyor belts pretty much of the sediment. So the pictures that I showed so far are basically the areas where the sediment is coming from, the origination areas of the sediment where the erosion takes place. And then once the sediment reaches these arroyos, it's moved down very rapidly with each pulse of rain and flows of these arroyos. The issue is that actually only 12 to 18% of soils that erode in this landscape make the soil grains, the soil particles, only 12 or 18% of them make it to the river in one single year on average. So a lot of the sediment is captured in the landscape, in these arroyos, on little plateaus and shoulders in the landscape. And then because it's not consolidated strongly, it becomes more erosive over time and flows down. But for much of the individual mineral soil particles, it takes years before it actually reaches the river. So let's now zoom in with an overview of this area, all the way down to our topic, the soil. And we're zooming farther. And then you get a detailed view of what this land looks like, how bare the soil is, and then what's underground. And you see it's mostly sedimentary clay and silt material, some sand at the top, and sparse grasses and pinon and juniper. The roots go relatively deep, maybe a foot, but below that you have pretty much mineral soil. So our focus area is the Arroyo de los Arianos, which is one of those areas that surprisingly has a spring. And in this case, not only just one spring, a series of springs, and an entire slope wetland. And a little bit of that slope wetland you can see at the bottom left, and it stretches for many acres all the way up this area. And it provided water to the community of Montecito for many years. And we're now going to try to activate a video. We have a drone flyover. These technologies with Zoom are tentative still, and We know that it may not work for us or for all of us or for some people to actually see this. So let's see what we can do. And I need to mute myself, or maybe not. Let's see how this works. I'm going to activate it now, and then we get a flyover. Okay, I need to go back. We'll do it again. So what you're seeing here is flying to the south over this Secano and Montes landscape with the piñons and junipers looking up at the mesa there, what I call the Sierra part of this landscape type. Then we're flying back over the wetland, and you see how the wetland eventually forms a very narrow arroyo and extends with cottonwoods and willows all the way down, and eventually flows to the settlement, to the village of Montecito. And so gradually the valley widens where more and more sediment is settled out. And then in high pulses, it follows this arroyo and drops it there all over the fields, in fact, and sometimes in the acequias. We're seeing here the side arroyo just to the east, and you see how narrow that is. And it's a very small arroyo. It's not as large as this one here on the right. And small arroyos move, of course, their water and their sediment much more rapidly because they don't have as much flat area to have it settled out. So the pulses of water and erosion in the narrow and small drainages are much more powerful than in these big ones like this one, which also stretches much farther north, as you can see here. So that worked reasonably on my side. I hope that everybody had a chance to see this in a reasonable way. So what stresses are on the soil? Well, I identified three categories of stressors. The natural stressors caused by drought, fire, flooding, and slope and geology-driven erosion. So the steeper the slope is and the longer the slope, the more gravity pulls at the dirt and pulls it all down. And you can see that, for instance, at the top right. Then there are legacy stressors from past grazing, probably 200 years of grazing at this point. Tree removal. Over the last 200 years or longer, many trees have been removed, causing bare dirt. Then there has been dryland farming all the way up to the 40s and 50s in much of these areas. And water extraction. For instance, the Arroyo Los Arianos was an area where water was actually piped all the way down to the villages for irrigation in the early 20th century. And acequias ran down, and there were water tanks there for cattle. And these infrastructure pieces are still there. You can see them if you walk up to it. And then there are current stressors from clearings, from off-road vehicle uses, from ongoing farming, although that doesn't happen so much in these areas that I showed, sometimes construction and roads. And they are major problems because they kind of stir up the dirt all the time. They compact it and prevent plants from growing. And as a result, the soil becomes very sensitive to water, wind, and other disturbances by animals and people, for instance, that kick the particles down and eventually picked up by wind and water. They become the sediment flows in the arroyos, etc. And many tracks and trails turn eventually into arroyos. So let's now go to what soil is. Now that we've had an idea of this landscape, what is soil really? Well, there are many definitions. And for this presentation, I used the one offered by the United States Department of Agriculture's Natural Resources Conservation Service, NRCS. which developed this one for purposes of categorizing soil types. And so let's read this. Soil is a natural body comprised of solids, minerals, organic matter, liquid, and gases that occurs on the land surface, occupies space, and is characterized by one or both of the following: horizons or layers that are distinguishable from the initial material, the mineral soil, as a result of additions, losses, transfers, and transformations of energy and matter, or the ability to support rooted plants in a natural environment. Well, that is a mouthful, but I'm going to explain that in the next following slides. And this will all come to life literally and figuratively as we go over this. So how is soil formed? And that is a key question, because soil is not just a static thing. Soil is something that, just like our human bodies, like a plant, or even better, like an entire ecosystem, is alive and is an interaction. And it's an interaction of four environments, you could say, or four spheres. The biotic life in the biosphere, gases in the atmosphere, water in the hydrosphere, and then the mineral component in the lithosphere. And so where these different spheres overlap, you have what is called the soil sphere or the pedosphere. And then there are influences from the outside that are somewhat related to them all, that is time, because everything regarding soil happens through time. And topography in relation also to gravity and human activity. And then maybe the energy from the sun, but that is in part captured under the atmosphere. So therefore, we need to really think of soil as a living, continuing, energetic environment, not just something as if it were a kernel of dirt. And that is, of course, the question that's often asked: how is soil different from rock or dirt? Well, as I said, soil is a complete ecosystem. It's alive. And as an ecosystem, all the interactions between the different parts and different living organisms are mutualistic. So it's a give and take. They're symbiotic. They walk hand in hand and help each other, or they're competitive. And there are, for instance, multiple fungal systems underground or insects, and they all are out there to survive, although they are sometimes working together. But if they have a chance to have the upper hand, then they take a competitive role. And then it is part of the mineral matrix, or the mineral network, you could say, of the upper part of the Earth's surface. Rock and dirt are, you could say, all over the place, but don't have living components. Soil is only forming and developing in the upper part of that mineral component of the Earth. And soil has proportional amounts of living biomass versus no life, organic versus mineral material, and the proportional amounts are expressed in these soil layers or soil horizons. And you can see those in the form of texture and color differences. The picture on the left gives you an impression of that. It goes, I don't know, 1, 2, almost 2 feet down, I think. And you see at the bottom mineral soil, then some, and that is very yellowish brown, then some lighter soil with some roots in it, and then a much darker type of soil, which has a lot of organic matter. And then at the top, near the ruler, there is about 4 or 5 inches of duff, of plant litter material that still is broken down. And I'm going to explain what is happening in all those layers. But first, a really close-up idea how soil is alive with all its roots, rootlets, and even these very fine little white threads are fungal mycelium threads or hyphae that, in this case, I think they're mycorrhizal fungi who actually help the roots take up water and minerals, ions from the soil, moisture levels, and feed the plants in that way. And in exchange, an entire life exchange with millions and billions of microorganisms takes place here. And when they die, their carbon component is exuded in the soil, which gives it a browner or blacker or grayish color. And that's why you see those colorings, especially where the fungal and root components of the soil are. And the soil is then also bound together by the exudates of those fungal threads. And therefore you have little clots of dirt that just don't fall apart if you actually even make a profile in the soil like this one. And to just give you an idea, pretty much half the screen from top to bottom here is about 1 inch. So you're looking at 2 inches by 3 to 4 inches of an area. So what makes each soil horizon different? So each soil horizon is really defined by the different layers that are there. And this is the textbook layering, but sometimes these layers are missing, or sometimes they are much thicker, they're different in proportions, etc. And they have different colors in different soils, and that makes really each soil horizon different. So at the top, you have what's called O horizon, which is the organic zone with mostly plant litter, like I showed in the picture. And then what is called the A horizon, which is the surface or topsoil zone, where there is particulate organic matter. And together, they're called they're upper soil, and they have very high biological activity. Then we go a little deeper, and there's often a pretty distinct difference, like you could see in the picture too, where you then suddenly only have mostly roots and fungi and bacteria, but they're much harder to see, and they're concentrated along the roots. And that's called the B horizon. And the organic matter is mostly concentrated along those root channels, and there is some mineralized carbon forming there too. And in between, you have the mineral matrix. Going deeper, you get into the parent material, stone material or sedimentary material, which is called the C horizon. If there are still some roots in there, it's called C1. But if life is no longer present, then it's called C2. And this is the lower soil with lower biological activity and more geological and hydrological activity. And then way beyond that, actually not shown in this graph, is the R horizon, the parent rock. And in the C2 and R horizons, you basically have no biological activity. So looking at these again in a soil pit at the Arroyo de los Arianos, you see the O horizon there at the top, just below the grasses and the rushes. Then the A-B horizon transition just there where the soil knife is. Then you have a B horizon with some roots. And at the tip of the soil knife, you see the mycelial threads coming out, and it's a little browner there. And they dangle in the wind, actually, if you are there. This is a still picture, you cannot see it, but it is really nice to see it if you're out there. And then in the bottom right, the transition from B to C horizon. Now, you may wonder whether soil science is geology or biology. Well, it is, of course, both. But about 100, 150 years ago, when soil science was gradually emerging, there were two camps. one camp really thought that it was a geological science. And I happen to have grown up in the Netherlands, where a lot of the soil science was thought of as a subset of geology. And in a book of the 1950s by a famous Dutch professor, and I think a British professor, they wrote, in the beginning was the rock, and the rock was the mother of the soils. Well, that was one opinion. The world was full in those days also of people who very strongly thought that it was only a biological science, and who had studied soils from an agricultural perspective, like Rudolf Steiner and there are many more. And it took us pretty much a half a century or more to eventually just see that it is a combination of both, and as expressed also in those 4 spheres that I showed. So here you can see how actually we might think of them in 2 different ways. So what's essential about soil today? Well, I think it is mostly essential to think about soils as a living environment, and that we have gradually come to understand soil not only as a condition or a status quo situation, but an ecosystem with countless microorganisms, including bacteria, fungi, protozoa, nematodes, worms, insects. And there are, in fact, billions of soil microbes in a teaspoon. And we know now that the interactions between those ways of understanding soils is really at the bottom of the soil processes that take place, and the different cycles of energy, minerals, water that happen in soil and that make soil really what it is, not so much a status quo or an in situ situation, but really a process, a continuing evolving process. So if we then actually take a snapshot picture, go back to that just for our understanding, it is important to understand what soil consists of. Well, it consists of inorganic material, mineral matter of about 45%, and a little bit of organic matter, that's only about 5%. And then the other half is water and air that fluctuates a lot based on how deep you are, and of course, whether it has rained, irrigated or not, or how compacted the soil is. But this is important to understand also in relation to the problem of erosion and sedimentation, because that all has to do with to what extent soil can hold water. And that has to do with the pores between sand grains or clay particles or silt particles. Because there are 2 forces actually that draw that water in. Those are the capillary forces, or wicking, and osmotic forces, which is the water adherence to molecules. And they are together called the matrix or matrix suction. That is the suction forces in the soil matrix. So after soil has been saturated, part of the water drains away out of these pores under the influence of gravity, and part of the water evaporates. And the moment at which the force of gravity and evaporation is the same as the matrix suction, the combination of capillary and osmotic forces, the drainage will stop. And at this point, the relative water availability in the soil is called the field capacity. That means that basically all that water is being held on the surface of the soil particles. And you can see now in this example that, for instance, the sand grains have proportionally much smaller surface than clay particles. So clay will hold more water through those matrix suction forces than sand grains can do. And then eventually when sand grains are really optimally compacted, which they do over time by themselves in the force of water, their pores are relatively large in the sense that water will just go through it to reach that field capacity. And, but still those pores are too small for roots to go through because of the natural compaction of sand grains. And so that makes sediments actually a very problematic soil for plants to grow in. And so therefore, we need to do something about those pores. And those pores and the structure of sand and silt and clay is called soil structure. But I am not talking about one component here, because we need to just add, well, I want to say water. No, not yet. What we need to add is organic matter. And organic matter together with life forms, worms, insects, etc. And why is that? Because organic matter together with life forms helps create diversity of pore sizes and directions. It fills up these pores and it pulls and pushes these grains apart. And it helps mix the organic matter throughout the soil horizons as a result of the working of water, roots, and animals or insects. And then you eventually get optimal root penetration at greater depth, and then more water at greater depth, more life forms and biological activity that breaks down all that organic matter, and that's called humification. And then we get what is called humus, which is an old term. There are modern scientific terms, but it is still a very effective term because a lot of people know what it means, because it's a stable organic compound. And that is critical here. A stable organic compound, plus you get ion exudates from the biochemical soil activity as the chemical reactions that are holding water, but also are critical as plant food that's being taken up by the fungi into the roots and help strengthen the plants. Retention of water due to diverse and connected pores and multiple ions is made available, and I mentioned that before. That is eventually the bottom line of this, that is really critical to soil. And with this, we've added the biosphere component to a soil that maybe only has mineral, water, and air components in it. And therefore, we then have a soil that becomes alive. So what role does soil acidity play? Well, that is directly related, this question, with the humification. That's why I put it in here. A good amount of organic matter and active humification processes lead to a neutral soil with a pH between 6.5 and 7. If there is not a lot of decomposing organic matter or way too much, the pH will drop. That often then also is paired with a situation in which there's too much water, not enough air, and then you get a very poor environment for insects and metazoic fauna. The humification process is then slowed down because there is just not enough life in the bottom to support these insects and other living organisms to do the decomposition job. And only then fungi and bacteria have to do that because they can survive in those situations to some extent. And they don't do that well enough. And you don't get earthworms, for instance, which are very important to eventually create what we know as humus, worm castings. And too little organic matter then leads to alkaline soils, which is even worse because that is not very good for soil microflora and microfauna. And then you get even less biological activity, especially if the pH drops above 8. So let's look at that a little later. So now I want to end with talking about pinyon juniper uplands, because that's really what we're looking at in terms of this ecosystem. There's an entire separate soil health and pinyon juniper ecosystems webinar series that I'm doing starting tomorrow, but I summarize it here. What we know is that there is still much to be discovered. It's kind of an open field of knowledge. We do know that also in pinyon juniper uplands, there's root-associated microbiota, fungi, and that they are essential for the trees and grasses there to grow. and that what happens in the soil is very much related to tree density and ground cover, and for the resilience and balance in those ecosystems. So there's definitely carbon accumulation in plants, litter, and soil, organic matter, and in microbes in those ecosystems. And mineral carbon sequestration in those Pinot Juniper ecosystems results from plant growth and soil microbial activity. I would like to mention also, and we get to that later, that biocrusts are very important in these landscapes because they capture carbon and they help maintain soil structure. So they prevent soil from just falling apart into individual grains. And the types of carbon and the sequestration rates depends on stem density again, tree age and size, and the size of the woodland openings. So this must have been a dazzling first 45 minutes of the presentation with a lot of information. So if there are any questions, I would like to take 5 minutes for a Q&A, and you can actually send your questions through the chat box that is in the bottom of your screen that may pop up if you hover over it, and send us some questions if you have them. You can also take a little water break if you want to, and in the meantime, I will answer the questions that Adrian will bring to me.
Okay, so the first questions come from Ashley Giles, and she was wondering if the group could get references for the reports that were mentioned when you were speaking about the different landscape terms in New Mexico. And also, if anybody is wondering, the slides should be provided to you in your materials. If you just signed up in the last 24 hours, you might have not gotten an email yet, but we will be sending those. So if you want to go back over, say, that picture and table that Jan-Willem supplied about the landscape terms, they can be found there. So are there references for the reports that were mentioned, Jan-Willem?
So the reference for the picture that I showed is Arnie Valdez's study on acequia landscapes in northern New Mexico. He was the environmental planner for Santa Fe County for many years, and then moved to his home area in the San Jose Valley where he started a farm. And I think he's still consulting all over northern New Mexico. And I can see if I can find his reports and other reports. Similar terminology was also used by Juan Esteban Arellano, whom I am very much thankful to because he introduced me and taught me a whole lot about this landscape and the historical terminology and landscape structure and history and all that.
And how about that 17th century reference that was about the history of New Mexico villages you mentioned?
Yeah, that's in a book called Thinking Like a Watershed, Voices from the West by Jack Loeffler and Celestia Loeffler, in which also Esteban Arellano and others describe the history of watersheds in the historic landscape of northern New Mexico. There are also scholars at the UNM, and maybe they're retired now, I think Enrique Madrid and various others who have published about all this.
Great,
I think Enrique de la Madrid. Yep.
The next question comes from Irene Cordoba. If your soil appears to be very compacted and clay-like, what is the best way to amend for healthy soil and plant growth? Yeah, so that is a difficult situation. You have to do, well, there's various ways of going about it. So you can, for instance, mulch it or sheet mulch it, but that requires, well, that it is only practical in small areas like backyards or 1/10 of an acre or something. If you go beyond that, you may need to use multiple techniques, or you need to go in a phased approach that you do as much as you can with mulching and sheet mulching
over time, or so that you don't do it all at the same time. In the past, people have, of course, used tillage of the land, and that has actually led to our discovery of the last couple of decades that tilling, and especially often tilling, like every year, breaks down the life in the soil that you actually try to build up. So by tilling the soil, you eventually get to the problem that you're taking away what you build up in 1 or 2 years by eventually having a healthy soil. So, so one-time tilling to loosen it up might work, but you really have to add organic matter, mulch it, work it in, have cover crops. And it depends a little bit on each situation, what type of clay soil you have, how much water is available. You can also start an agroforestry system, or a system in which you plant shrubs, trees, and sow grasses in between to in pocket seedings, for instance, so that you let the plants loosen up the soil. Another situation, depending on really the terrain and the soil type, is to keyline plow it, in which you don't turn the soil, but create furrows in which water can infiltrate to greater depth and bring the organic matter deeper. What is the best technique depends really on the location and the farming infrastructure, the size, the slope, water availability. So it is hard to give one-size-fits-all answers.
Great. And if you do on-site consultation, we'll give out Jan-Willem's information at the end. So if anybody's wanting to know a little more about or invite him out to his land, we can provide that for you, right, Jan-Willem?
Yes, and I want to caution that my expertise is really in upland areas rather than in farms. So I'm a dilettante when it comes down to farming and gardening, but I can make references, and there are many other sources of people who are much more knowledgeable that we can find for you. But if it comes to upland areas, forest, wetlands, watersheds, larger landscapes, then I can probably help out.
Okay, the next question is from Bill Hargraves. What soil tests are available to determine health of soil and for determining what soil microbes are living in the soil?
Wow, there are many different tests, and I'm not even fully familiar with all those. A lot of biological tests are very expensive, but because they require in-depth laboratory work. And so that makes that kind of an approach to soil testing, trying to understand what microbes live in the soil, a rather expensive, laborsome activity, as far as I know. And so there are other approaches to testing soil health, and we get to a few of those, very kind of simple, superficial ones. They are almost more self-do assessments that I will present in this webinar now in the second half. So yeah, I think I would leave it at that. And I would like to go back to just that part, because that is a nice segue into the second part of the webinar.
Great, and we'll get to the other questions at the end, so don't fret.
Yeah, and I will have to speed up because it took us a little bit of time to get started. So I want to go back to this slide where I show the principles of soil. So again, I want to look at this now differently and think about that of it now not as a graph, but as if everything were churning and moving. And that actually, the most important thing I want to express here is that there needs to be a balance between these different spheres. And if there is if the inputs from each of those spheres and the energy and the activities are not balanced, soil is not forming. And in a way, soil will be degrading because it's not supported by the living components in the soil that are nourished by each of the contributions of each of those spheres. And look at this table because that explains it to some extent. In the biosphere, we're producing plant and animal litter products that are used in decomposition in the soil to form that humus that I talked about. Water is, of course, the main product of the hydrosphere, and that's being stored and absorbed in the soil and taken up by the plants. And that transports a lot of the ions from the lithosphere that eventually as nutrition get into the plants. Then gases and heat are the atmospheric components that lead to gas and heat exchange in all the chemical reactions that are part of that decomposition process. And then the minerals are weathered by the plants and the chemical processes that happen in the interactions of the other spheres that lead then to these ions that are necessary to sustain life. So basically the pedosphere, the soil, is a huge biochemical underground factory, you could say, that needs to stay working for plants to grow and for everything that grows underground to support the plants and support each other to grow more soil so that we can have more plants and buffer all the elements that are maybe conspiring to break that soil down, like heat and fire and people treading and all those kind of things. And saprophytic fungi that actually prey and break down the plant material, which is again a good thing because we want decomposition. So there is an ongoing process here, and that is so important to understand. So eventually that leads to a healthy environment and to healthy soil itself. So the soil, in its interactive role between what's above ground and below ground, plays this critical role in providing from the molecular level to, for instance, microclimate buffering, food for plants, all kind of benefits to what lives in the ecosystem, both above and below ground. And that it is in a way producing food for everything and an environment in which multiple life forms can thrive. Well, then the question is, of course, how does it all go down, right? How do soils degrade in health? Well, we have seen that in our lifetime, we've seen some structural changes in all these four spheres that interact to create a soil environment and a soil environment that gradually degrades in some places. We've all heard about the atmospheric changes, for instance, increases in carbon dioxide and annual mean temperature increases that have a critical impact on the land and from the gas mixture in the soil and increased heat that drives some of those processes. And that leads then to a more rapid breakdown of organic matter in the soil with a more rapid volatilization of the CO2 and water vapor from the soil, evaporative loss. So, and related to those atmospheric changes, water availability in the soil decreases. So that you basically get soil moisture imbalances. You see more often that soil dries out at the top and that there are larger areas that are dry. And once those dry areas get connected, other things start to happen. because as a result of the climate change, we see more and more intense rainstorms coming down and water transportation across the landscape. And also, we as a population have grown and are claiming more and more on the land, and sometimes have excessive uses of the land, like here, where we, not only as a result of drought, but as a result of our activities, create a lot of connected bare dirt. And then, as a result of all these things, you get locations where, despite moisture, you have very poor plant regeneration. And if plants don't hold the soil and don't support the underground life, water can flow through cracks and start to flow underground through cracks and openings and over the land surface and start picking up speed and causing erosion. And that leads then eventually to pretty bad situations where we have massive soil loss. So then the key question is, how can we keep our soils healthy, right? Healthy soil is defined by the 2019 New Mexico Healthy Soil Act as soil that enhances its continuing capacity to function as a biological system, increases its organic matter, and improves its structure and water and nutrient holding capacity. So those are all the different functions that I basically explained in that graph, you remember? And it puts in the center the biological system and the organic matter component, the stable organic matter or stable organic compounds that are so essential for soil. And this definition of what a healthy soil is supported by 5 soil health principles in the Act that by implementing each principle, it helps keep the soil healthy, and by implementing them too, you can actually restore soil health over time. It helps to maintain optimal soil structure, and that leads then to improved resilience, self-healing capacity after stresses or damage, and it will help sustain the biological functions. So what are those? The 5 principles are keeping soil covered, minimizing soil disturbance and external inputs, maximizing soil biodiversity or biodiversity in general above and below ground, maintaining a living root, and integrating animals in land management. And that could include natural grazing animals, livestock, birds, beneficial insects, and keystone species such as earthworms. And earthworms, again, are essential to healthy soil because they are a major key component in breaking organic matter down and creating that humus, the very fine, stable organic compounds that we need in the soil. So why is it that soil health principles seem to address only soil biology? Well, the reasons for this, I believe, are that the soil health program is probably a response to the agro-industrial approach to soil in the last 4 or 5 decades, in which the functions and, in fact, entire ecosystems of the soil biosphere have been replaced by agro-engineering procedures. Fortunately, in the last several decades, we've become aware that the environmental benefits of the biosphere and in relation to soil health and overall ecosystem health are much bigger than what agro-engineering can provide. And therefore, we realize now that healthy soil, especially through the biosphere component, is the lifeblood of healthy ecosystems above ground. And we know that agua es la vida, and I added to that, y el suelo es la cama que tiene la vida. So it is really important to understand the life-giving force of soil and how that's sustained by the soil health principle. And so how are we going to use those principles? First, in monitoring through observation and analysis, looking actually at surface components and a little bit at subsurface components, and some soil assessments, some simple kitchen approaches that I want to show that can help. And then management practices, and we'll address those in other webinars. And I'm going to go through this quickly because we have less than 15 minutes left. Soil texture can be tested with a beautiful soil ribbon approach, where you actually follow a procedure that points out how long the ribbon is that you're creating by putting a little bit of dirt and water in your hand, kneading it, and then paying out a little bit of that dirt that's connected over your forefinger, and then seeing how long you can stretch it. And dependent on the length, you get a different type of soil that fits into this graph and helps you identify what you have. This is all in a curriculum document that you can access, and you can read it again once we send you the PowerPoint, or when you access that online. So this is how it works. You put that soil in your hand, rub it, and pay it out, like at the bottom right. And then you rub it again with some excess water to see whether how smooth it is. If it's very gritty, then there is a sand component. If it's very smooth, there is a predominant clay component. And if it's neither one or the other, then silt dominates. In some cases, maybe dependent on a hand, you can even see it in your hand palm. If I learned in school that if the dirt enters in these very fine pores of your hand, you have a high clay component. If it stays on your hand here, you have a high sand component. And if it enters into bigger pores and lines of your hand, you have a silt component. So what we see here is that we have a strong sand component and we have some clay. I need to now forward this. And the soil texture test, we measured it, and it leads to breaks between 2.5 and 5 centimeters, which is a moderate clay content. And as I said, there was a high sandy component, so this was sandy clay in that triangular graph. You can also use a soil settling test in a water column and measure it. And that leads then to a roughly proportional distribution of dirt. And after 1 minute, you measure out the sand, which has fallen to the bottom. In this case, about 4 or 5 centimeters. Then you look at the silt, which was very little here, 0.5 centimeter. And then after 24 hours, you can see when it's clear how much clay has been deposited, and that's the rest. And also this came out as a sandy clay. Then you can do a soil structure assessment, which was really nice by putting clots of dirt in a tray and see how quickly they fall apart. And if they don't fall apart, you poke in them maybe with a little stick and see if they're still holding. The top right is just crusted dirt from an arroyo edge, and that fell apart almost within a minute. Then in the center, we have some topsoil with moss. That stayed really well together. The topsoil with biocrust, the top left, also stayed very well together even after an hour. Soil with mycelium, bottom right, stayed very well together. Only the edges released some grains. But even by poking with a rod, it just didn't fall apart. And deeper soil with caliche crust dissolved also within pretty much 1 minute. So this gives you an idea how important biocrusts, mycelium, and moss are to hold soil structure and to prevent it from, say, raindrop splash and other erosive forces. And then we did a soil acidity and alkalinity test. And we'll run a little video to see how that worked. And I think I need to do a voiceover here, maybe. Yeah, we put half cup of distilled water in 2 tablespoons of dirt in the left jar, and then also half a cup of baking soda. And then we stir it again, and we'll see if it reacts. If there is fizzing happening, bubbles, then we have a slightly acidic soil because the acidity reacts with the baking soda. But there is no reaction. So there were some slight bubbles, and that might be a reaction of the organic matter with the baking soda, but pretty much no reaction. Then we're doing half a cup of vinegar, and we'll see what that does. And it reacts. It reacts like Coca-Cola buzzing and fizzing, or when you pour beer, you can see it, right? A lot of foam following this reaction, and it stays reacting. So we have clearly an alkaline soil here. So then the last method I want to show, and we're going into that in the next webinars, is the bullseye method of assessment of the landscape. There are different methods. Here is one for rangeland health, and I adapted it also for woodland health and riparian areas. It's based on getting your landowner to give you the desired plants and everything, or get those from the Web Soil Survey, and then fill out what you currently see. And you're being guided by 14 questions, basically, that relate to 14 indicators that are all listed here as well. And you're going to walk around and take a look and look at your question description, which we'll show in a minute, and then figure out whether you're in bronze, which is not so good, silver, which is improving, or gold, which is in the center, and hence the bullseye method. So it's a good method to track change over years and tracking progress and seeking early warning signals. It's a hands-on tool for those working directly with and on the land, and a solution on a scale between no monitoring and detailed technical, scientific, qualitative monitoring. And it's still practical and science-based, although it's qualitative, and it's a rapid appraisal approach. And here you can see a table of the key questions. For instance, how much bare ground is there? How much erosion? How much plant pedestaling? The litter amount, litter distribution, litter incorporation, dung breakdown or incorporation, the presence of desirable plants, H-class distributions of plants, plant species diversity and functionality, living organisms, plant canopy, plant vigor and color, and plant distribution. And then there are definitions that help you assess whether you're in the gold, silver, or bronze. And in many ways, above ground plant health helps us identify what's underground, because plants are very good indicators as to what is happening with their roots and what's happening on their roots. Soil health assessments are rather technical and often complicated to analyze, sometimes costly because they have to be done in a lab. And you need to do many to get good statistical outcomes. And this is a practical outcome that has proven very useful for a lot of ranchers in the field to make management decisions. And what eventually counts is the health and vigor of the plant production above ground. And so this method makes a link between the 5 soil health principles and above ground health. So you eventually then start looking at the land and filling out this table. And here at the Arroyo de los Arianos wetland, we see that we're actually doing pretty good. Good plant cover, not a lot of pedestaling, like you can see at the bottom right, maybe a half or quarter inch. And eventually you can fill it all out. And we've seen that there is a lot of good conditions here. You see there the topsoil situation and how much organic matter and incorporation of organic matter there is, and even dung breakdown and how much there is and how incorporated it is. And that leads us then to Q&A. And I must say, time management has been a challenge. We have 3 minutes left, and I know that Quivira has to go off to another webinar immediately after this. So I would suggest that if you have questions, that you email them to us. We will send you an email with a link to the PowerPoint and a link to an evaluation. Then you can actually respond by sending us your question, and then I'll make an effort to respond to that question. A sneak peek to the next webinars is, the next one is August 26th at noon about restoring soil health in degraded uplands. And then 2 weeks later again, and then September 23rd, the last one. They're all on the Quivira website with more description. So please visit there to take a look. And with that, I thank you for your attention. And if Leah or Adrian has something to add, then I'll leave it to them right now. Thank you all.
Thank you, Jan-Willem. And even though I do have to go, I believe even if I leave, you all could stay on. So if you, Jan-Willem, do want to stay on longer, just wanted to offer that up.
Oh, wonderful. Yes, I am available. So if the Zoom can stay up and Adrian can help me, then I'm willing to entertain questions maybe for 10 minutes or so.
Great. That sounds great. So I think it should work fine if I exit, because you're co-host, it should work fine. So I will leave now, and that was wonderful. And thank you everyone for coming. And yeah, I will also post the Quivira website in the chat box here.
Excellent.
Thank you, Leah.
Leah. Yeah, thank you for you and Quivira, all your help. It's been a great first webinar, Jan-Willem. So there are a few lingering questions folks have. And if you still have questions, type them in, or if you want to unmute yourself after I ask a couple of these questions that were typed earlier, that would be great. And I'll give you the signal. But one of the questions is disturbance of soil structure ever helpful for the formation of more organic matter and increased carbon sequestration?
I missed the beginning of the question. Can you read it again, please?
Of course. Is disturbance of the soil structure ever helpful for the formation of more organic matter and increased carbon sequestration?
Only in specific circumstances, and if you don't do it or overdo it by repeating it every year. So I know that a lot of farmers, even those that go to organic farming with no tillage, no turning of the soil, they may have situations where the initial soil just needs to be turned to work in a cover crop or a mulch to get at least some of that into the topsoil and then kickstart the biological process. If you keep doing that, you will inevitably destroy part or much of the organic process that has started by ripping up the mycelial network that's there, the fungal network, killing and by exposure a lot of the microorganisms and insects that are have to live in the soil, in the dark, in a specific mixture of gas, temperature, and everything. And if they're exposed, they will just die. And so it's a tricky proposition to continue that. And so even the NRCS now, the federal government agency supporting farmers since a year and a half or 2 years now, is actively proposing no-till agriculture and using other ways like grazing, like cover crops, like spreading mulch, compost, and those kind of things to improve the soil.
Excellent. What are your thoughts about land imprinting? And if you could just also explain what that is for people that don't know what that is.
Yeah, my understanding of land imprinting is where you use a technique or a machine really to poke holes of various depths into the soil to actually break crusts, to break inhibiting compacted areas in the subsoil to get more water and organic matter, maybe even seed, to deeper depths. Keyline plowing is in fact an alternative or subset of that, where you don't do an imprinter with big pins that go in the ground. Keylining is ripping it without turning it, and that leads to the same aeration and improved rooting depth and water depth. And typically, from what I've read, you can have results 10 times faster than if you don't do anything or plow. But if the person who asked the question has a different definition of imprinting, then I think it is important to hear that.
Okay, great. And I'm actually going to open up the floor now for other folks to ask their question. So if you take yourself off mute and ask your question, if two people ask at once, just, I guess one person hang back, but I'll let people ask their questions now.
This is Irene. Can I ask, what is keyline mean? I didn't understand that term.
Yeah, it requires some explanation, sorry. Keyline plowing is part of keyline design and is an Australian method of land reclamation and land improvement, where a specific design lays out a bunch of, you could say, water spreading structures and almost acequia type structures that bring water from a drainage to the drier parts of the landscape and spreads it out. That's the keyline design component. And it is a little bit more involved than acequia agriculture. Then the keyline plow was developed by the inventor of keyline planning, Jansens in Australia about 100 years ago, which is a plow that rips the soil, so that makes deep, very narrow furrows without turning the soil, so that basically you can, and it's being used on or just slightly off contour, so that actually water percolates underground at slight off contour grade from the wetter parts to the drier parts of the slope in those furrows that you plow.
And you're saying keyline, K-E-Y-L-I-N-E.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
And feel free, there is a lot online about it. So if you Google it, you get a plethora of images and descriptions.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions?
Jan-Willem, if nobody else is going to ask their question, there was another one. I'll give a moment just because this person asked a couple other questions, but does anyone else have a question? Okay, this person was wondering about how do you biocrust fix carbon?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. I wish I knew more about it, but it is a symbiosis between, I understand it's a lichen, a moss and an algae that work together and that form, that basically have slight, so first of all, they're a photosynthetic symbiotic organism. And so they have little tendrils, tentacles in the soil and have a microscopically small interaction, like with a plant, that interacts with the soil, and I believe even a fungal interaction that then helps in a microscopically small way than plants do it to convert dead biomass underground that's created by plant litter and dead insects and dead bacteria that are then basically falling apart into carbon, and that is then being stored in the soil, and as a result of chemical reactions between the minerals and the exudates of that process, some of that carbon is even connected to the mineral tissue under the plant. But they are creating, in fact, in a very small scale, also humus directly below where they are on top of the soil. And there are other people that know much more about it, and I wish I'm still learning, and I think this is a field in which you can learn for the rest of your life. So I'm going to look into this because this is fascinating. Thank you.
Are there other questions folks have? It doesn't seem so. I don't see any typing or anyone taking themselves off mute. There's a couple of references that myself and other people typed in the chat box about land printing, keyline, plowing, and microbiotic crust, as well as the website that Leah typed in for the series of webinars. So I think that does it for our Q&A, Jan-Willem.
Wonderful, thank you. I also see that still people got online. We have now 54, and I want to apologize to those for whom it took a long time to get in from the waiting room, if that was really the case. So we will have to figure out how we can make that transition from waiting room to webinar better. And I am sorry if that caused inconvenience, and I hope that we can solve that problem. So thank you very much for your interest, attention, and patience. And I hope that many of you will join us on the 26th at noon for when we're going to talk about how soil degrades, erodes, and what you can do about it. So that will be a soil and water conservation webinar with very specific examples around Dixon. Thank you. And thank you to Adrian, and thank you to Leah and the Quivira staff for facilitating this, and for the Embudo Valley Library to be the fiscal agent for this project. And I must say then in one voice, and of course for the State of New Mexico Healthy Soil Program to support this financially and with the inspiration that they're spreading across the state. And again, feel free to email me when you have my email address. You actually have it here right on this page. And feel free also to respond to the emails that Quivira is going to send out with links to the information. And if there are questions remaining, I will try to respond to them in that way. Okay, have a good day. And I would suggest, actually, I cannot stop clearly, that if you come to the webinar next time, or if you go outside right now, to go to a place where there is dirt, dig a little bit away and stick your hand into it. Because I think there's nothing better than to feel it, to feel the soil, especially if it's soil under a plant where undoubtedly there is life and organic matter happening. And compare that with sand in an arroyo and feel the difference and feel how the soil under a plant or in a field, a cropping field, is alive as opposed to soil that is just dirt. And that's what I want to leave you with today. Thank you very much.
Okay, great. I'm going to end the meeting for everyone, Jan-Willem. So thank you again. Bye-bye.
Great. Thank you. Bye-bye.